My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to do a book review of Roverandom, one of Tolkien's short stories, which is very much more oriented towards children than some of his other fare. And you can find Roverandom either on its own or in the collection The Tales from the Perilous Realms, so you can get it either one of those two ways. And it has an interesting backstory. Basically, his son Michael had been given a toy dog as a gift, and then while they were vacationing on a beach somewhere, he ended up losing the dog, and Tolkien ended up writing this story as kind of a way to cheer him up. And you'll see why that's relevant as we get into it, but I just kind of wanted to point that out at the beginning. So I'm going to kind of give a brief synopsis of what the book is about, how the story goes. I'm not going to spoil everything though. And then at the end, I'll kind of tell you what I think about it. Before I get started, I do need to thank my latest patron on Patreon, Warren Gassaway. Thanks a lot, very much. I will put your name in the description below. And if you also would like to support the channel, then you can do that at Patreon. I will have my link in the description below as well. Now, on to the story. The story begins with Rover, a young puppy, in the yard of an elderly woman, and he's playing with a ball. Now, a man comes by, and for reasons that I'll just kind of skip over, Rover ends up not liking the guy and takes a bite out of his trousers. Well, it turns out that the man is actually a wizard named Artaxerxes, and in kind of revenge for getting bit on the bottom, he turns Rover into a toy dog, and a very, very small toy dog at that. It's not clear exactly how small, but we find out later he's definitely small enough to fit into a pocket, so certainly no bigger than probably that. And not only does he turn him into a toy dog, but he kind of warps him into a toy shop, into some box full of other toys. He is found there by one of the employees, who puts him out as an item for sale, and sooner or later somebody comes along and buys him. Now, what he realizes during this early period while he's in the toy shop is he can kind of move, but very, very little, and can't really make much noise either, although at night he seems to be a little more able to move. So kind of almost like Toy Story. When nobody's around, toys can do a little more than they can otherwise. But so anyway, he gets bought and then taken to this house, and he's given to a little boy who is the younger of two brothers that we know of. And this boy, of course, is basically Michael. I mean, this is Michael Tolkien. This is where the backstory of why Roverandom was written comes in. So he has this, Michael now has Rover as a toy and very much likes him. So at some point, the two boys go out running on the beach. Michael, or Little Boy 2, as Rover calls him, just because he doesn't really know their names, and he's the second or younger of the two boys, puts him into his shirt pocket, and they go running on the beach. Rover, trying to escape and get back to his home, can barely move and manages to wiggle himself up high enough that he eventually falls out of the pocket into the sand. Unfortunately for him, he still can't really move very much. But later, when everything is still, it's nighttime, or at least late enough that nobody's on the beach, another wizard named Samathos pops out of the sand, and he's kind of a sand wizard, we're told. At least his head pops out. And he talks to Rover, and Rover kind of tells him his story, and he's like, well, that's kind of what you get for, attacking a wizard, but I'll see what I can do. I can't really undo the magic for you, but I'll try to work something out. So he gets his seagull postman named Mew to take Rover in the meantime to visit the man in the moon, who's apparently the greatest of all the wizards. Mew therefore takes him and flies over the edge of the world. And there's a little element you should keep in mind for later. And eventually makes it to the moon after passing the Isle of Dogs, which we get a little brief glimpse of, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that. The man in the moon, when he sees Rover, also gets a letter from Samathos kind of telling him the story, and the Man in the Moon kind of just doesn't do a whole lot with Rover at first, except to give him wings and make him a little more able to move. He also has his own dog, who also is named Rover, who says, we're not really sure how true this is, that he was the first dog ever given that name, and he was called that because basically he wandered everywhere and eventually chased a butterfly over the edge of the earth and fell to the moon. Again, not really sure how much to believe this guy, but anyway, because both of them are named Rover, the other dog says, or maybe it's the Man in the Moon, I've forgotten now, but basically says, well, we're going to call you Roverandom so as to avoid confusion. So Rover, now Roverandom, is now a flying dog on the moon, and he gets into a lot of adventures there. So on the white side of the moon, Rover and Roverandom explore a lot. They fly around and do a bunch of different things. We find out about moonbeams, which are things you can apparently capture, giant white spiders. There's a lot of dragons, and in fact, one of their adventures involves waking up the Great White Dragon, and they get chased by him, and lots of interesting things happen as a result. I don't want to go into too many of the details, but they get into a lot of different activities together. And of course, Rover is glad to have Roverandom as a companion because the Man in the Moon kind of tends to keep to himself and not do a whole lot with Rover, the older moon dog. So they get into a lot of these adventures, and eventually the Man in the Moon actually comes to Roverandom and says, I'm going to do something different with you. And apparently he's never done this with the other Rover. So he kind of takes him downstairs in his tower and puts him into a dark hole where he falls seemingly forever. And he comes out on the dark side of the moon. And the Man in the Moon follows shortly after and comes out and basically kind of just takes a nap for a while. He's waiting for something, and so he just decides to sleep for a bit to wait for it to happen. Roverandom, while he's waiting around, starts to hear the voices of laughing children and sees what he thinks is something going overhead, but he's not really sure what's going on. At any rate, the Man in the Moon wakes up and says, oh, it started already, and you're kind of wondering what's happening here. So he takes Roverandom to this kind of a garden where there's a lot of children playing, and what we gather in the course of the story is that these children are all dreamers. They're people who are on Earth, but they're dreaming, and in their dreams, some of them come to this place on the moon. And just as a side note, this is not necessarily significant for the story of Roverandom itself, but in Tolkien's early versions of his Silmarillion mythology, there was a very similar concept. There's of course, the Lonely Isle, or the Isle of Tol Eressëa in Tolkien's mythology, which is where many of the elves eventually return to. His kind of the frame story is that there's this human who actually makes it there, and he's getting a lot of this information, and he finds out that there's this one cottage where people who dream go in their dreams, and it's kind of a similar thing to that, which is not the only connection to his mythology that we run into. But at any rate, he's playing around and he sees this one boy that he recognizes as Little Boy 2. And so he starts playing with Little Boy 2, and they have great fun, and he realizes, I actually like Little Boy 2. Why did I run away from him? So anyway, they have a lot of fun until finally it's time to go, because Little Boy 2, of course, is going to wake up. And they end up leaving the Man in the Moon and Roverandom, that is, and Roverandom kind of asks the Man in the Moon about dreams and whether they come true and things like that, and the Man in the Moon is kind of giving sometimes, kind of vague answers. He's not being very specific, probably so as not to get his hopes up. But at any rate, they go back to the Man in the Moon's tower, and eventually he gets another letter from Samathos saying, I have a plan for what to do with Roverandom, so we're gonna work this out. So the Man in the Moon sends him back with Mew the seagull, and now we enter the next phase of Roverandom's adventures. When Mew returns Roverandom to the magician or wizard Samathos, who the Man in the Moon calls Samathos, leaving out the P as being rather too persnickety, I suppose. Samathos explains that he arranged for Artaxerxes to meet and marry a mermaid princess, so as to kind of distract him from the whole issue with Rover. And after doing so, he attempted to remove the spell from Rover, but failed, which implied to him that Artaxerxes had put some kind of a anti-magic removal spell on Rover, and therefore, well, I can't do anything. So basically you're left with the option of going to Artaxerxes himself and asking him to remove the spell, because that's the only option left. So he then basically calls Uin the great whale, who was apparently the oldest whale in the seas, and has him take Rover down to the bottom of the ocean where the mermaids live, and of course gives him the ability to breathe underwater at the same time. So Uin, the whale, takes him down to where the mermaids are, and he kind of wanders around a bit until he finally meets a mermaid who just happens to be Mrs. Artaxerxes now. And she, of course, is married to Artaxerxes, who apparently is now the head of Pacific and Atlantic Management, or PAM, which acronym recurs several times, which I'm sure is a bit of humor on Tolkien's part. But at any rate, she sees the dog, and she gets Artaxerxes, who just happens to be nearby, to give him, to make him into a mer-dog, who Rover has already seen an example of nearby. He gets to talking to this other dog, and this other dog is also named Rover. Again, more humor. And this other dog listens to Rover's stories of his adventures in the moon, and of course the other moon dog, Rover. And Rover, the sea dog, or mer-dog, tells him, I'm not so sure about that guy. I'm really the oldest dog named Rover. They named me that because hundreds of years ago, I went aboard my master's ship when he wasn't looking, and all the shipmates called me Rover after that, and then I eventually, ended up in the sea. So you could see Tolkien is playing on this idea that too many dogs are named Rover. So anyway, the mer-dog Rover says, well, I'm just going to keep up the thing of calling you Roverandom to avoid confusion, and also it seems kind of appropriate because you end up in all these random places and never know where you're going to be next, so it works. These two end up having a lot of adventures in the ocean, just like they, Roverandom had in the moon, and he's always trying to get a chance to talk to Artaxerxes to try to reverse the spell, but Artaxerxes is always busy. Sometimes he's not really busy, but he just doesn't want to deal with it, and he's also kind of still mad at Rover for biting his pants. So they have a lot of adventures. Eventually they come back at one point, and there's been some issues that Artaxerxes has been called upon to deal with. There's apparently a great sea serpent that he has to deal with, and here's where the adventures get really interesting, because it's kind of the big, huge sea serpent in the ocean, and apparently it's having a dream. It's been in this cave sleeping very nicely for a while, but now it's dreaming and disturbing things because of its size, and Artaxerxes has been called on to solve this problem. Now, the narrator tells us he doesn't really have any business trying, because there really isn't any wizard that can do anything about it. The Man in the Moon, who, as I mentioned, was the greatest wizard of them all, had tried once upon a time, but it didn't end well. It ended with a continent sinking, which seems to be maybe a reference to Atlantis. But at any rate, the story then continues with Artaxerxes going to the cave to check out what was going on, and Rover and Roverandom both follow along to see what's happening. Roverandom being at this point kind of upset at Artaxerxes for constantly putting him off and wanting to annoy him. When Artaxerxes finally gets to the cave where the sea serpent is, he's being pulled in this carriage sort of thing. It's a giant clam pulled by a bunch of sharks. Roverandom decides he's going to bite one of the tails of the sharks, which then bites the tail of the preceding shark, and so on. until finally the whole thing ends up slamming into or actually bites the tail of the sea serpent, which wakes up the sea serpent. And so things are now really bad. Artaxerxes gets the blame, and he has to concoct a spell to put the sea serpent to sleep, hopefully, but it doesn't really work that well. It just gives him really nasty dreams, which makes things worse. And so things just go from bad to worse, and they just keep devolving until finally what happens is the sea serpent wakes up and basically says, I'm kind of mad. Artaxerxes has to leave the ocean or I'm going to really do some bad stuff. So Artaxerxes basically gets the boot. He's told to leave, and he ends up collecting most of his spells and dumping them in his backyard, which end up creating weird things in the realm of the mermaids. But he gets ready to leave. So he and Mrs. Artaxerxes, the mermaid, and Roverandom, who by now Artaxerxes is feeling slightly less ill will toward, because he's still asking him to change him back into a dog, and after everybody else thinks that he's a complete failure, this is kind of nice for him, because it's like, well, at least somebody thinks I can do magic. So anyway, he agrees that when they return, they'll, get back on land, then he'll turn him back into a dog, and so they head back to land. One thing I forgot to mention before, one of the adventures that they got into before coming back to all this, one of the trips they took was with Ewan the whale, who took them almost to the eastern edge of the world. Again, we get that edge of the world concept, which also I should have mentioned before is kind of in Tolkien's earlier mythology. Well, and even I don't think he ever really changed it, because even all the way to the end, the Atlantis myth that sneaks in as Númenórean into his mythology, it's with the sinking of Númenor that the world becomes round. So the world is flat in the Silmarillion mythology. So again, we kind of see links with his mythology. But here's where it gets really strong, because he then takes them westward almost to the edge of the world, and it says they pass the Magic Isles, and they get almost to basically the Bay of Elvenhome, and Roverandom thinks that he can see a tower, maybe, way far off. And we're basically being told that, that he's seeing Eldamar. This is, the part of the Tol Eressëa or Valinor where the elves live, and just barely catches a glimpse of it. And Ewan basically says, don't tell anybody about this. I didn't mean to go that far, and if anybody actually learns about it, then I'll really catch it. So we see here a very direct connection to Tolkien's greater mythology. At any rate, this chapter ends with Artaxerxes agreeing, once they return to land, that he will turn Roverandom or Rover back into his regular self. So then we get to the last chapter. When Artaxerxes, his wife, and Rover, now we don't have to call him Roverandom anymore, finally return to the land, Artaxerxes is about to change him back to a dog, and then he realizes, oh, I kind of got rid of all my spells and magic at the bottom of the ocean. I can't actually change you back anymore. And of course, Rover is terribly upset at this, and his wife is also upset and basically says, look here, if you can't change him back, then I'm going to leave you. But not being the total meanie like Artaxerxes kind of was in his grumpier period, she produces a magic bag that she had saved from all the stuff that Artaxerxes had dumped out. So it turns out Artaxerxes can turn Rover back into a normal dog again. He sticks him in the bag, shakes him around a bit, and out he comes, a normal-sized dog. So at that point, Rover now can finally do what he needs to do. So he basically has to walk. Artaxerxes doesn't teleport him or anything. He has to walk back to where he belongs, and he gets into typical dog type adventures on the way, chasing things, getting into, fights with other dogs, that sort of stuff. But he is by now a slightly older and wiser dog, but he's following his nose and making his way back, surely, if slowly, to his home. And all the while he's kind of thinking to himself that, well, turns out maybe this is one of the dreams that doesn't come true, remembering his time from the moon and the man in the moon, thinking that, well, I have to go back to my actual owner, the old lady that we met at, well, we didn't really meet her at the beginning, but we learned about her at the beginning. So finally he makes it to the old lady's yard, and who does he see playing in the yard but Little Boy 2? Turns out Little Boy 2 is the old lady's grandson, and he's there on a visit. And he sees Rover, and he actually recognizes him from the dream, and even there he recognized him as the toy. So we get this rather interesting conversation between the boy and the grandmother, basically where the boy's like, "That's my dog," and the grandmother's like, "But I'm pretty sure I bought him." And anyway, you can imagine the young child version versus the parent or grandparent version. Eventually, of course, the old lady gives in so as not to upset Little Boy 2, and it ends up being his dog thereafter, and he goes back to live with the boy. And we learn that over time he becomes one of the wisest and most respected of dogs. He has many chats with Psamothos because he visits the beach. And we even find out that Artaxerxes and his wife ended up having not too bad of a life after he kind of gave up magic. He opened up a candy shop, and his wife gave swimming lessons and was apparently so good at it that nobody tended to notice her tail. How's that for a fantastic ending for them? But at any rate, that's pretty much the conclusion of the story. Rover, having learned his lesson, don't bite strange people's trousers, and having gone through all kinds of adventures that no dog should ever really have to go through, finally makes it back home, but also makes it so that he ends up with the boy that he ended up coming to love so much. So good for Rover. So, having given a synopsis of the story, in which I hope I didn't spoil too much, but you have to give away a few things. What do I think about this? Well, it is definitely a children's book, but I will say I just finished reading this to my 3-year-old, and it's probably a little above his head, honestly. But part of that is because one of the things you notice in this story, unlike a lot of his other works, Tolkien goes into some rather long, rambling sentences, which seem to be slightly for the purpose of being humorous, but it makes it a little harder to follow for younger minds, probably. But nevertheless, it is perfectly appropriate for any age in the sense that, it's a whimsical story. It's not, there's no real, themes that you can't pick out of it that are older. And of course, there are the object lessons such that there are a little more obvious, which is more in keeping with a children's story as well. So I mean, it's probably better for like the 5 to 10 crowd, somewhere in that range, depending on how advanced the audience is. But the other thing about this story, of course, is all the connections with his own mythology, which by the time he wrote this was before The Hobbit, if I remember correctly, the timeline. So there was all this mythology he had been working on, which he never expected anybody to actually read or see any part of, except for the few people like C.S. Lewis that he had shared it with in more intimate settings. So this is kind of his way of like sneaking his mythology out to other audiences, including his son Michael, of course. But and eventually it becomes published and thus sneaks out to a broad public, but that wasn't necessarily his intent at the time. But it is very much kind of in keeping with the other stories that are in the collection, the Tales from the Perilous Realm, in the sense that, which, by the way, those are the Smith of Wootton Major, Farmer Giles of Ham, Roverandom, and what was the other major one? I forget, but I mean, you can look it up on Amazon and it'll tell you what the stories are, but they're all the short stories, and I think the Adventures of Tom Bombadil are in there as well. But at any rate, this is very much in keeping with those stories in the sense that it's shorter fiction, fantastic, and yet not overly, it's not like high fantasy like Lord of the Rings. It's just introducing those fantastic elements, and in some ways being very, I'm not sure what I want to say here, not deliberately making fun of it, obviously, but certainly introducing them in amusing ways and in ways that to a regular reader, for an adult would make us laugh. For a child, might be taken rather seriously as this is the way things are, because a child, depending on their level, might just take it that way. But it makes it an interesting story because he's mixing what appears to be real modern day England with flat earth and man in the moon, and there's all these elements that come in that are just such a jumble that you would think it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, and yet it does. So it's a really fun story, and I will say this, it's only 5 chapters, but most of the chapters are actually kind of long. So if you want to read through a chapter at a time, you need a little time to sit down with it. But I mean, it's a very engaging story. Beyond that, it's a very, you do want to know what he's going to get into, and as is typical with Tolkien, he tends to leave a lot of stuff kind of on the periphery. You get into a lot of adventures, but he doesn't really describe a lot of them. So, like in his Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion stuff, you have to kind of use your imagination to fill in a lot of blanks. But be that as it may, the adventures he does get into are quite amusing as they are. So that is my review of Roverandom. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope it gave you a good idea of whether you want to pick it up for yourself at some point. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTlore. Support me on Patreon at the link in the description below. And you can subscribe to me over here, and you can find a few of my previous videos up here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.